So today we are going to focus on the architecture of Mannerism and Palladianism. So this is a period sometimes categorized as the late Renaissance period, sometimes considered as a new kind of tendency in artistic practice called the Mannerism. And Palladio, as an architect and artist, accomplished a lot of works, and he also wrote a book, and he himself kind of belonged to a separate category. But sometimes both are considered as the late Renaissance, the aftermath of the Renaissance in the 15th century and early 16th century. So Mannerism, a artistic movement or artistic tendency in the mid to late 16th century, has a lot of characteristics that are different from the high Renaissance or early Renaissance that is covered in the previous lecture. So, early Renaissance in art and architecture, so roughly like late, starting in the, it really as a intellectual movement really started in the late 14th century, and so developed into a new fashion in art and architecture in the 15th century. So representative of early Renaissance art and architecture include, like in painting, Masaccio, and in architecture, Brunelleschi and Alberti, which was covered in the previous lecture. And the high Renaissance from the late 15th century to early 16th century. So this period it features the careers of Michelangelo, Raphael, Da Vinci, in architecture like Bramante, and the Sangallo family, etc. So it's a period with a lot of big name artists and an architect. So toward the middle and the late 16th century, a new tendency started to appear that started to kind of made distortion of those classical forms in art and architecture. And that tendency is called Mannerism. Mannerism is represented in painting by works of Jacopo da Pontormo on the right, contrast strongly with those high Renaissance work. For example, the painting and architecture by Raphael. Mannerism transgresses the classical canon by playing and deforming its conventions. High Renaissance developed a new kind of artistic expression that using Greco-Roman classical art and architecture and its humanist philosophy as their main kind of backbone, features those concentric form and highlight balance and harmony. So in Raphael's painting, you can see it is very balanced, very symmetrical. And the architecture featured in the background is in a concentric design. Contrast also sharply with the previous medieval architecture that features those axial design as represented in Gothic cathedral and the ecclesiastical Christian church interior that features a long hall. But Renaissance, focus their design on these kind of centralized form and highlight harmony and balance. That toward the mid 16th century became more and more stable, more and more kind of standardized, and people get tired of that. So the new Mannerist fashion is often characterized the opposite of that high Renaissance balance and harmony, characterized by those restless, nervous, and tortured forms. Its dramatic ambiguity and tension are seen as contrasting with high Renaissance principle of harmony and repose. Mannerism can be observed in architecture as well as sculpture and painting. In architecture, it is represented by the works of Giulio Romano and the late work of Michelangelo. So from your study of Michelangelo's work, you know that in a lot of Michelangelo's design, there was already a lot of ambiguity, a lot of kind of playing with classical form, creating those architectural element that is hard to be classified in the traditional term. An empty niche, a column that is baseless, supported by a bracket in an empty space, a column that is set inside a wall. All those features were already trespassing the classical balance and harmony. So it really started with the late work of Michelangelo, but today we will look at Giulio Romano's work as a expression of Mannerism in architecture. In painting, you can see that in Pontormo's painting, it features a lot of diagonal rather than horizontality and verticality, and the human body are distorted, elongated, and expressions on the faces are not as calmful and peaceful. Rather, they were exaggerated with expression, and it create more movement and also creating a lot of kind of distorted form that is almost impossible in nature. For example, some critics pointed out, a human body does not really bend that way. You cannot bend right there. Same as this, angel carrying the body of Christ. So that body bend right there in the middle of the upper body. It is kind of impossible. And also, all the figures have super small head and the bodies are elongated. So there's a lot of distortion, a lot of exaggeration, compared to the high Renaissance classicism. In architecture, we can observe the same tendency. The same tendency can be observed in Romano's Romanos architecture. So here I'm showing two plans. One is Romanos' design of Palazzo del Te in Mantua, which is this one. It's a residential architecture featuring a garden, a courtyard, and buildings surrounding those spaces. The one on the upper right was designed by Romano's teacher, Raphael, the same painter who painted the painting I just showed you. Raphael representing the high Renaissance spirit. So from the plan, you don't see much difference. It is in the detail. In both cases, they feature, large geometric garden design. The garden are divided into geometric shapes, and the buildings are arranged symmetrically in great balance. So you can see Romano's design is pretty much the same for the overall planning of the palace, the palazzo. It is in detail that shows the distortion and exaggeration of the Mannerist spirit. Standing in the garden courtyard, what you see are buildings surrounding on all four directions, featuring those classical orders with columns and entablature, right? Those classical architectural form, columns, entablature. Entablature was divided into architrave, frieze, cornice. So all those common features that had already been popularized during the High Renaissance period by great architects like Raphael, Michelangelo, Bramante, etc. But you also notice there are something that is kind of unusual and not that harmonious. The first thing you might notice is that the columns are not evenly placed. So there are some bays that is extremely narrow, other bays wider, and that irregularity is not that regular. That irregularity is not rational. For example, there are some places the bays are the smaller bays are not consistent in size as well. I think that's the first thing one notice, the deviation from the classical spirit. And secondly, you might notice there are some empty, there are some dark holes in the wall. And in classical architecture, they shouldn't be there. It looks as if, this is a ruin. Some parts are broken, collapsed, maybe. But it's different. It's, if this is a newly constructed building, those holes shouldn't be there according to High Renaissance design principle. They are designed, they are not, they are purposefully designed. So all those holes, the little windows are purposefully designed. They were not missing part in the architecture. Getting closer, you notice that those small windows, like here, they are in the place of metopy, right? So here we have the frieze. The frieze in the Doric order, we have the triglyph and the metopy, triglyph and the metopy. So those missing stone are the metopy, and thus resulted in a window. And some other parts are below the entablature, like this one. This window is open just above the arch. And like in Michelangelo's design, here we have this archway, which is okay. It's a doorway, but then we also have these empty niches. Are the windows, are they supposed to hold sculpture? It's ambiguous. And again, they are not large enough to hold sculpture. Like this one, it's very shallow, right? So kind of playing with classical form. And some of the, some sections of the architrave are broken, like here. This architrave is broken, and the stone is dropping, you know, and the triglyph drop with it and just left a small space above it, right? So these are all kind of a distortion of classical form, and they are purposefully designed. They are, you know, the architect is having fun, or he is doing something purposeful, maybe trying to evoke a sense of ruin. You know, those classical ruins are, you know, were everywhere in Italy, in Rome, and the surrounding areas. Those Roman ruins can be observed. So Romano is probably inspired by those dilapidated classical ruins and purposefully designed a new building, but in the appearance of those classical ruins. And at this corner, you know, in addition to those holes and you know, rustication, right? You learn the term rustication. The walls are showing the three-dimensionality of those building blocks. That's called rustication. You know, there are two columns which are really close to each other, right? This column and that column, squeezing into one another, and created a tension. And that tension is not harmony, right? It's a tension, it's a struggle. So those, as if those two columns and the two sides of the wall are struggling for space there. The opening of that window is deliberately kind of uncomfortable. Why does it have to be opened that way? You know, on one side you have a section of wall, but on the other side it's just next to that column. Why can't the architect put it in the middle, right? There's no reason for doing that. That's obviously a deliberate choice by the architect to create that tension, to break away from the high Renaissance classical harmony. That's a deliberate effort made to exaggerate that struggle, that uncomfortable competition among architectural elements. The interior, the architect, Romano, created some illusionistic painting. So late Renaissance architect, like the high Renaissance artist, you know, Michelangelo is, both a painter, a sculptor, and an architect. We call those people the Renaissance men, right? They are Renaissance, they are multi-talented. Same are the late Renaissance artist and architect like Romano. So he was also a painter, sculptor, and architect. He painted these paintings that were illusionistic. Like here we have a horse standing, painted horse standing in front of those pilasters, right? And seemingly a doorway behind the horse. So all those are painted. None of them actually exist. They were all painted on the wall. They were illusionistic painting. That one was okay, at least, the horse is standing on the ground. But the other one, is the horse is elevated above the ground on top of a doorway. And that is a more kind of creating more kind of tension, more drama to have a horse elevated that way above an empty space. So he was trying to break away from the harmony, from the balance, and create some spatial, formal, as well as psychological tension. So such an approach to illusionistic painting is unusual. Although illusionistic painting was not unknown before Mannerism, in the high Renaissance architect Bramante's work, so Bramante, who was practicing in the late 15th century, belonging to the high Renaissance generation, same generation as Leonardo da Vinci. In his design of San Maria Presso San Satiro, he painted and sculpted on the back wall there to create an illusion of a space that is really deep. But in fact, that space was only a couple feet deep. It appeared as if it was very deep because he played with the linear perspective. He painted that arch much smaller than the one that is the real arch on the wall. And all those lines are actually pointing down. So standing in the middle, when you look at that, it created an illusion as if that there is a very deep barrel vault. In fact, on section, it is only like that. So, it's not a real barrel vault. It is a slanting surface that gives you an illusion, because when you look at that, you would automatically perceive that arch at the same height as this one. When your mind doing that gymnastic translation, you would automatically perceive that space as deeper. You would imagine that is a space like that. So that's illusionistic. However, in high Renaissance, Bramante's work, that illusion was trying to create harmony with classical form, because the limit of the site, the architect was not able to create a Latin cross shape in that building. The plan of that building is kind of a T shape, right? So there's a hallway, And that is the location of that illusionistic painting. So Bramante created that illusionistic painting to make you feel there is a deep space behind it, which didn't really exist, so that you can imagine a perfect Latin cross. Otherwise, it is a T-shaped interior, which is not ideal for a church. Right? So that illusionistic painting was meant to create architectural harmony. But Romano's illusionistic painting in Palazzo del Te has nothing to do with harmony. The illusion was created to break harmony, to create a drama. And that is the contrast between the high Renaissance spirit and the Mannerist spirit in both art, architecture, and painting. He did much more than that. Sometimes the distortion and illusion created in the interior could be more distressing. So this is an interior, and there's a fireplace in the room. Around that fireplace, Romano painted murals that shows a collapsing building. The famous art critic Vasari, who had been writing about Michelangelo and promoting Michelangelo as the greatest artist ever existed. So he also commented on the building. So Vasari belonged to the generation of Romano. Vasari was a student of Michelangelo. So they belong to the same generation. He commented on the interior in the Palazzo del Te. This interior is called the Hall of the Giant. He talked about the mural and showing everything falling apart, painted on the wall. He said it's terrible, but he was admiring that terrible work. He said, quote here, "No more terrible work of the brush existed, and anyone entering the room and seeing the windows, doors, and other things so twisted that they appear about to fall, and the tumbling mountains and ruins will fear that all is about to come about his ears, especially as he sees the gods fleeing hither and thither." It shows the collapse of great building and killing the giants, etc. And the gods were trying to escape. And that painted brick lintel above the fireplace as if it was also collapsing. But in reality, everything is just painted. The architecture is just painted on the surface of the wall. The painting is also combined with architecture in a new fashion. The painting by Romano in his architecture was dissolving the architectural space instead of strengthening the architectural space, which also create a huge contrast with the high Renaissance approach. Right? So Mannerism, high Renaissance by Raphael, the famous school of Athens in the Vatican Palace in Rome. right? So Raphael painted those walls, but his painting was creating an architectural illusion, and that architectural illusion was in harmony with the architectural space, just like what Bramante did in the church of San Maria. Romano's approach is totally different. Here, architecture disappeared. There's no architecture anymore. So he was meant to dissolve the wall, create an illusion as if you are not inside a building, you are not inside a room. Vasari commented again. So he talked about the mural has neither beginning nor end, so that objects near the building seem very large and those in the distant landscape are gradually lost. So he was commenting to the illusion space created by perspective. So those different objects look small and those close objects look bigger. So you feel, there is the real space, infinitive space there. So he was creating that illusion, dissolving architecture. Continue the quote, the room, which is not more than 30 feet, not more than 30 feet long, looks like an open country, the floor being of small round stone and the wall at the junction being painted like them. There seemed to be no cornerstones, and the palace looks extremely large. So Romano created a space within just a 30 feet long room, a kind of seemingly endless space, because the corner is also dissolved. Didn't show the corner. You see the cloud blurring the border, creating that kind of playing with the shadow and light surface to dissolve that corner. Right? So this is a manipulation and a deliberate distortion of architecture. Painting and architecture were not in a mutually kind of strengthening cooperation. And this is the spirit of Mannerism. So on one hand, there is a, well, I think I'm going to do a different